We are in week 3 of the New Testament in my Disciple Bible Study class. And we began with Matthew, of course, and last week we read Mark, and this week we're reading Luke. And that means that the story of the feeding of the 5,000 I've read 3 times already. And next week, when we get to John, I'll read it again. So what's significant about that is that outside of the passion narrative, meaning Jesus' last few days on earth, where there's lots of detail and the stories kind of align. So outside of that passion narrative, this is the only story that appears in all 4 Gospels. So that alone tells us something, doesn't it? This moment when Jesus takes what is not enough and turns it into more than enough is worth paying attention to. And to be honest, there's a couple of details in Mark's telling of this story that I really love. So one of them has nothing to do with the sermon that I'm still going to share because I love it, and one has to do with the sermon. So let me set the scene. Jesus and his disciples have been going non-stop. They are healing, they are teaching, they are sending people out 2 by 2. It has been relentless. And so Jesus says, let's get away. Let's go somewhere quiet. It's time for Sabbath and rest. But the crowd somehow hears that that's what they're going to do. And so when they cross the water, they get to the other side, the boat lands, there's the crowd. They followed them, thousands of them. And what gets me about this is Jesus' response, maybe because it's better than what my response would be. He doesn't sigh. He doesn't say, hey, let's turn the boat around and see if we can get ahead of them and go back. He doesn't, do the Hollywood hide behind sunglasses and a ball cap. Mark tells us that Jesus looks at the crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he ended up teaching them all afternoon. Eventually, the sun begins to set, and the disciples come to him and say, hey, man, it's getting late. We're in the middle of nowhere. You've got to let them go so that they can eat. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. So the disciples quickly do the math, and they're like, oh my gosh, that's a better part of a year's wages. There's no way this is impossible. But Jesus says, go and see what you have. And so they come back, and they're like, 5 loaves and 2 fish? And then Jesus does something really simple. He has everyone sit down in groups. And here's the detail of Mark that I just love, love, love. They sit down on the green grass. This is in the middle of the desert. They sit down in the green grass. And Mark has already told us that the crowd was like a sheep without a shepherd. And so now the sheep are sitting on green grass. And suddenly, don't you hear the echoes of Psalm 23? The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. And he makes me to lie down in green pastures. That's just an image to sit with all week, isn't it? It has nothing to do with the sermon, but it's beautiful, right? So Jesus takes the bread and the fish and looks up to heaven and gives thanks and breaks the bread. And here's the second detail of Mark that I love. It says basically in the Greek, it's kind of ambiguous, but he just keeps giving the bread to the disciples. You can almost see like he's breaking off and continuing to give the bread to the disciples. And the disciples just keep distributing. Somehow in the breaking and the passing and that ordinary act of sharing, there's always enough. It kind of reminds me of a church potluck where people show up and they say, hey, I didn't bring anything. And we say, come on anyway. And there's always enough food, right? Always. And in this case, there were 5,000 men and women and children, plus women and children. And when they say, has everybody eaten? There's 12 baskets left over. Now, I don't think this story is just about a miracle on a hillside. 2,000 years ago, I think it reveals something about how God's economy works. We see the same pattern throughout Scripture. Remember a couple of weeks ago when we talked about that wedding at Cana where the water became wine, but it wasn't just like, oh, Jesus brought a couple bottles of wine. It was over 500 bottles of wine, and good wine. That's the pattern. Water gets turned into wine, and 5 loaves get turned into 12 leftover baskets. What is not enough becomes more than enough. What seems impossible becomes possible. Not in spite of what we bring, but through what we bring. So we've seen this kind of abundance right here at First United Methodist Church of Arlington Heights. But none of you remember it. So about 100 years ago, I read the book. About 100 years ago, the people of this church said, oh my gosh, we need a bigger building. We need to expand. And so when the cornerstone was laid on September of 1927, the pastor cast a vision of a building that would be open for all, not just the community of the members of that church, but for the whole community of Arlington Heights. Sounds pretty similar to what we still do today, right? And the plan was simple. Everyone would give double what they had been giving for 5 years, and the building would be paid off. And so on Easter Sunday of 1928, the bishop preached to celebrate the opening of this new expansion of a building. Now, if anybody's a history person out there, you know that less than a year later, the Great Depression hit. And this wasn't just like a downturn. This was an economic collapse. Savings accounts weren't insured at that time, and people's savings were wiped out. It talked about one woman who saved 10 cents an hour in babysitting and had ended up with $500 in her account, and the bank would only offer 35 cents on the dollar. And so people suddenly didn't even have enough food to pay their family, much less to give to the church to pay this mortgage. And I'm sure many of the people, like the disciples, thought this is impossible. And the women, despite the women, back then they had rummage sales back then, believe it or not. And they did fundraising dinners, and yet the church weakened. And by 1940, it was close to bankruptcy because they still had that 1928 loan that they had defaulted on. But in God's economy, the impossible is possible. And so as the Depression eased, those Methodist women, I'll tell you what, they tried a new fundraiser. It was called the Antique and Hobby Show. They got it from Gary Memorial United Methodist Church. They copied them. And it raised significant money. And then the men also, that's back when only the men handled the finances. The men on the finance team got involved, and they had a fundraising dinner that they cooked, I'm told. And then a new pastor arrived in 1941, and his goal was just to spend time in the community, and slowly the congregation began to grow, so that by 1950, the church was able to pay off its 22-year mortgage that had been underwater, that they thought was hopeless. And the day came when that congregation was able to have a mortgage burning celebration. They didn't have 200 denarii. They didn't have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but they had each other, and they had a commitment to the impossible. And they had a God who takes not enough and turns it into more than enough. So much so that just to keep going, that's 1950, they pay it off. What happens in 1957? They've already grown so much under the leadership of Berger Dahl that they say we have to move again. That's God's abundance. So I want to go back to the story for a minute. Jesus doesn't say, I'll handle it. He says, you give them something to eat. And when the disciples protest, Jesus doesn't argue the math. He simply says, go and see what you have. He doesn't ask them to produce what they don't have. He doesn't expect them to do the miracle. He asks them to bring simply what they have. 5 loaves and 2 fish. It is not a sufficient amount by human calculation, but it is sufficient by God's calculation. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar, writes that scriptures carry a deep through line of abundance, that the creation itself is filled with God's generosity. And in this story, he says, Jesus performs what he calls a subversive reordering of public reality. Subversive. That's the right word, right? Because the world runs on scarcity, on not enough money, not enough time, not enough resources, not enough hope. And Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fish and says, watch what abundance looks like. Compassion starts it. Jesus sees the crowd and is moved in his gut. And then that compassion becomes the energy for the miracle. The bread is broken, the sharing begins, and the impossible becomes the possible. Not long ago in Portland, Oregon, there's a man named Josh White who started a coffee shop a couple years prior called Heretic Coffee. And when it looked like that SNAP program last fall, when we were talking about the benefits ending, the food assistance that's used by 42 million Americans, he made a decision. He said, he let it be known in Portland, anyone who needs could come in for a free breakfast. They'd get a breakfast burrito, a cup of coffee, no questions asked. And people told him, you're going to go bankrupt in a week. And Josh White said, and now I read about this, it doesn't say anything about him being a Christian, but this is how God works, even if there's no, Josh White said, if we literally have to shut our doors, if we go broke making sure children have food for breakfast, I'm really okay if that's the reason we lose our business. 5 loaves and 2 fish. And guess what? The community showed up. Businesses, strangers, people across the city, eventually people across the globe poured in donations, $280,000 worth. To this day, they have given, I think it's 43,000 free breakfasts or something that might not be the quote. I didn't write it down. What looked like a path to bankruptcy became a demonstration of abundance when someone is willing to break bread and start sharing. So the good news is not, I'm so sorry, the good news is not that everything is easy. I wish that were the good news. The good news is not that the math will always add up, and it's not that you won't look at the crowd and feel the weight of not enough. We will look at the crowd and feel like sometimes we are not enough. But the good news is that the disciples' limiting beliefs does not limit God. You know, they weren't United Women in Faith, but our Methodist women holding dinners during the Depression didn't limit what God did. A coffee shop owner in Portland didn't limit what God did. And the good news is this, we find in Ephesians, now to him who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than we can ask or imagine. The good news is that God invites us to go and see what we have, to bring it forward, to break it and share it, and watch what God does with not enough. Amen.